Hello historians and welcome back to another episode. Today we are continuing our deep dive into the life of King Henry VIII and his reign. This time focusing on the period between 1537 and 1540. Now, you're probably sitting there going, well hang on, which wife was this? Well, during this time period, Henry VIII was actually a single man. He was a bachelor and he was looking for love. So we're going to join him on his hunt for wife number 4. People often document Henry's life based on his wives, with the misconception that he had wives back to back, which is sometimes the case, especially with the first 3, and with wives number 4 and 5. But it is often forgotten that there was a 3-year period where Henry wasn't married. Today, we'll be looking at King Henry VIII, the Bachelor. We start our story in 1537, and King Henry VIII is a grieving widow as his 3rd wife and mother of his only legitimate son, Jane Seymour, had just died. Although it's also worth pointing out that he was Henry's only son, as his illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy, had died in 1536, just weeks after the execution of Anne Boleyn. And even then, from the grave, Henry found a way of blaming her, accusing her of using a slow-releasing poison to kill his son. And Henry Fitzroy was the only son at that point because Prince Edward had not been born. Henry's advisors told him he should look for a 4th wife to continue the line of succession. After all, Henry was in need of a spare. Despite being a king on the dating market, he wasn't as much of a catch as you would have thought he was. His depression in his widowhood was the start of his weight gain. He was foul-tempered, and his ill health made him unpredictable. Henry was also aging as rapidly as his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, and was starting to go bald. Despite this, Henry did enter talks with several women, which included Christina, Duchess of Milan, Mary of Guise, and King Francis I for the hand of his daughters. However, Henry and Francis's negotiations ended rather quickly, as Henry insulted Francis early on when he asked Francis to send his daughters to Calais, so Henry could choose the daughter that he liked the most. From Henry's point of view, he wanted to meet his wife and converse with her first. Pretty understandable. However, Francis laughed at the idea, finding it preposterous and insulting. He was not prepared to have his daughters or ladies of court being taken out like prized animals. With the French alliance abandoned, Henry then read about the charms of the 16-year-old Christina, Duchess of Milan. She was 16, very tall, and of excellent beauty. The English envoy, John Hutton, remarked that he believed Christina bared a resemblance to the Lady Shelton, a woman at Henry's court that the king had openly admired. Side note, she was also a relative of Anne Boleyn. Henry definitely had a thing for that family. Christina seemed perfect. The only aspect that went against her was Henry's personal preference of bosom women. His second wife, Anne Boleyn, was supposedly slim, and he reportedly didn't like that as much, whereas his first and third wife, Catherine and Jane, were bosom women. The king declared, "I am big in person and have need of a big wife." With that in mind, Henry put Christina on the back burner and set his sights on French noblewoman Mary of Guise, mother of Mary Queen of Scots, although she wasn't at this point. Mary of Guise had also been recently widowed and was the eldest daughter of Claude, Duke of Guise, one of the most powerful men in France, and rumour had it she was as bosom as the king desired. After a quiet Christmas at Greenwich, Henry put the feelers out for Mary's hand in January 1538. Mary, fortunately, had been given prior warning and hurriedly accepted the hand of another suitor, Henry's nephew, King James V of Scotland, whom she married in the following May. Thomas Cromwell then suggested that Henry go back to pursuing Christina. In the March, Henry sent his painter, Hans Holbein, to Brussels to paint Christina's picture, and he spent much of the summer at Hampton Court Palace with his 3 children. When Henry received Christina's portrait, he was apparently enchanted, so he sent his embassy to approach Christina. The embassy approached Christina on the 7th of October, 1538. The young Duchess was very outspoken, and the idea of marrying King Henry VIII didn't appeal to her much. To be honest, I don't blame her. The King's Majesty was in so little space rid of queens that she dare not trust his council, though she does trust His Majesty, for her council suspected that her great-aunt, Catherine of Aragon, was poisoned, that the second was innocently put to death, and that the third lost for lack of keeping in her childbed. Apparently, and this is apparently, Christina said, if what she said is true, then Christina had a pretty good grasp on what King Henry VIII was like. Despite the English's best attempts, Christina said no. And her uncle, the Holy Roman Emperor, also stepped in to prevent the match. Back in England, Cromwell was under immense pressure from Henry. His favour was waning. Then he remembered that the Duke of Cleves had 2 unmarried Protestant daughters. Sisters Anne and Amelia, or Anna and Amalia, were as yet unmarried and Protestant. Delighted by the offer, the Duke offered his 2 youngest daughters. The English ambassadors arrived in Dusseldorf on the 12th of January 1539. However, they were not received by John III, Duke of Cleves, as he had died since the arrangement. Instead, the ambassadors were received by his only son, William, the new Duke of Cleves. William had strong views about women's modesty, so when ladies Anne and Amelia were presented, they were so well covered with a habit and apparel that the ambassadors could hardly see their faces, let alone their figures. Duke William did not like the idea of Hans Holbein painting portraits of his sisters. He wanted his painter, Lucas Cranach, to paint the portraits, much to Henry's dislike. William then expressed his concern about marrying one of his sisters to King Henry VIII, as any woman married to Henry would only know insecurity and unhappiness. And then he said that the Cleves were too poor to pay for a dowry. I think William had sussed Henry out rather quickly. Cromwell came to the compromise that no dowry would need to be paid if the king could send Holbein to paint one of the women, and Henry liked the picture. Cromwell chose the Lady Anne as rumour had it she was incredibly beautiful compared to her sister. Anne was rather intelligent. She could read and write in High Dutch, a language that Henry couldn't speak, and she was an expert needlewoman. However, she couldn't speak French, Latin, or English, one of Henry's tongues, although it was thought that she was intelligent enough that she could pick up the language. Because of the modesty of the German court, she couldn't sing or play an instrument, nor did she know anything about fashion or dancing, as both had been scorned at her home court. The Catholic Lady Mary was dismayed that her father was to marry a Lutheran heretic. Ironically, Mary and her stepmother Anne would later become good friends, and it was Mary that led to Anne's conversion to Catholicism. By the 11th of December 1539, Anne of Cleves had reached Calais and stayed there due to bad weather. With Anne's arrival delayed, Henry kept himself busy with negotiations for a proposed marriage between the Lady Mary and Duke Philip of Bavaria, another Protestant ruler. Mary declared that she would rather remain unmarried than enter such an alliance. Nevertheless, Henry pursued the match, and when Philip came to London, Mary was obliged to go to court to greet him. Unwillingly, she obeyed, and the Duke afterwards told her father that he wished to proceed with the marriage. Mary faked an illness so she didn't have to spend time with him, and eventually the marriage never materialised. The decline of Henry's own German marriage is what helped with the lack of enthusiasm for the marriage in the end. Spoiler alert! New Year's Eve, 1539, Anne of Cleves arrived at Bishop's Palace. While here, Anne stood at the window watching bull baiting. 3 men in multicoloured hoods leapt into the room, laughing. The burliest offered a gift from the king. Baffled, because remember she doesn't speak English or any other language other than High Dutch, Anne took it, then returned to the window. The stranger said something. Anne muttered something in German and turned away again. There was a long silence. The man stood confused, and then frustrated. He left. Moments later, he returned, this time wearing a magnificent purple robe. Only now did Anne realise that he was her future husband. She tried to smile, but it was too late. When Henry met his future wife properly, he showed no sign of dislike towards his bride. He welcomed her to England with great courtesy, and he stayed for the afternoon engaging in conversation, with the help of a translator, while Anne ate supper. Henry felt betrayed and deceived, as he felt that Anne looked nothing like her painting. He had brought with him a present of furs, but he was in such a state of agitation that he forgot to give them to Anne, and Sir Anthony Browne later presented them to her. The king excused himself, and when Browne caught him in the corridor, he could see the king was in a furious temper. Scowling, he said, "I see nothing in this woman as men report of her, and I marvel that wise men would make such report as they have done." Henry blamed Cromwell, who reminded his king that if the marriage did not go through, England would stand alone against France and Spain. Anne herself had done no wrong, and it would be most unchivalrous of the king to reject her at this late stage. If he sent her home disgraced, no man would consider her after that, and her brother may retaliate by declaring war on Henry. The king apparently stalked out of the council chamber in a rage, and the wedding between King Henry VIII and Lady Anne of Cleves took place on the 6th of January 1540 at Greenwich Palace. Thank you for listening to today's episode on King Henry VIII and his life between 1537 and 1540. If you enjoyed today's episode, then please support me any way you can, whether it be subscribing, leaving a like, commenting, or watching another. Until next time, have a wonderful day.